Hi there Matrix, and welcome to the last segment of the geography syllabus. We're still looking at economic geography and particularly the trade and transport section, and today we'll be focusing on the issues of globalization and trade, as well as food security and how that affects economic geography and people more generally, which is our human geography section of the exam. Without further ado, let's have a look then at globalization. If you look at your notes there, I've started off with a cartoon that I found on the internet which depicts or illustrates what we mean by globalization. Remember, globalization comes from the word global, which means the entire earth. So from a scale perspective, we're talking about the whole world. And in this context, it can mean many things, socio-economically, culturally, politically. Globalization essentially is the making smaller of the world through ideas or trade, technology and other improvements that have made life easier for some and arguably or ironically difficult for others, or more difficult for others. If you look at this cartoon, it captures the nature of what we mean by globalization. You can see here we've got a family who are obviously tourists and they've just come back from their holiday. You can see the bags and the camera case around the father's neck, and he says, "We got these cool hats at Nike Town in Paris." Right, so he's talking about France there in Europe, and the mother replies, and this great shirt at the Disney store in London. So they've obviously also been to Britain or the United Kingdom. And then the son, wearing a Tarzan shirt and some nice sneakers, remarks about his shorts. He says, "After a great dinner at McDonald's in Rome, we found these neat shorts at the Gap." Gap is a shop, remember? And yeah, he's talking about Rome, which is in Italy. So they visited 3 places on their little trip through the world, on their holiday, and they've bought something from each and every single one of those places. And if you look in the cartoon here, you can see they talk about brand names or things that we, even here in South Africa, are very familiar with. Nike, that makes shoes and other sports gear. The Disney store, which we associate with movies and all sorts of things with Hollywood. And also McDonald's, or McD's as you guys will refer to them colloquially, the fast food chain where we buy easy food to eat. So this is the idea of globalization. The world is smaller, or we are familiar with things that everyone in the world is comfortable or sort of knowledgeable about. And it's just taking a quick look at what we mean by the term globalization. But let's have a look at your study notes there, and let's have a look at some of the key concepts we're going to talk about in this section of globalization. In this session, we are going to consider what do we mean by globalization and how does it affect world trade or global trade on a planetary scale, remember? The fact that we have various trading partners overseas, Germany, other European nations, North America, Canada, and even the Far East, China, India, and all those sorts of countries down there on the other side of the world. We're going to talk about the character of globalization, what are the good and the bad things. So we're going to discuss advantages, and we're also going to talk about disadvantages. Not just what is globalization, but how does it affect economics and socio-economic, political, as well as cultural relationships between us and the rest of the world, and vice versa as well. And the good things and the bad things there, the pluses and the negatives, as it were, is what we're going to discuss as well when we look at some of your questions or some of the past papers as examples of questions. Right, so here are your notes where I've summarized a couple of the basic points for you. Globalization is the process of growing exchange between countries of the world. So here is a perfect definition for you, right? It's the process or the procedure of our relationship or our exchange between other countries in all sorts of things when it comes to trade. Ideas, goods, services, people, foreign exchange, money, all sorts of things that we are exchanging with the world is called globalization. Globalization involves the international trade and tourism and the spread of technology and ideas. Now, most of you wouldn't have traveled overseas necessarily, but I mean, once you finished matric at the end of this year and you're not going straight to varsity, I suppose, you could tour the world or take a gap year, as it were, and go and see places. That's what we mean by tourism, going to visit the world and to sightsee and to go and do fun things and pay for those services, pay for that experience, so that not only are you benefiting from an international experience, but also other people are making money from you buying food, living there, using the transport, catching the train or the bus, taking an aeroplane to get there, etc. Globalization is also about the exchange or the growth of technology and ideas around the world. Now, if you think of something as basic as your cell phone, or even just the internet, which we've taken for granted for many years now, that's made the world a much smaller place, or our interaction with each other a much more global experience. And that's what globalization is all about. These days, you can hop on a plane and be on the other side of the world within 12 hours. Not very far, obviously, but you can be in another country or even on another continent. And in terms of ideas and the sharing of ideas, the internet, YouTube, and all those sorts of things where we communicate, Facebook, Twitter, all these social networking sites that you all belong to, we're allowed to exchange ideas and thoughts with other people in the world that we don't even know at a click of a button, and basically within seconds of time, as it were. If you look at the rest of this definition here, it says it, referring to globalization, is the free exchange of capital or money, information, people and ideas across the world. Now, I've said free here in inverted commas because, as we'll see later, globalization is not necessarily always a free thing or a good thing. Free for some, good for some, but bad or costs a lot of money and is very expensive in many respects, not just from a financial point of view, but from labor or from emotions or from cultural sort of sacrifices in other respects as well. So the exchange of money or capital, information and people, because people go overseas, they work, they live overseas for extended periods of time, that's all part of globalization as well. Technologically, the development and the growth of consumerism, there's a main theme over there. The fact that we buy and sell so much stuff, that we use so much stuff, we consume all sorts of products and brands and ideas, and the entertainment industry, for example. Consumerism has meant that the world has become a more global place, and our experience of the world has become a smaller sort of experience, and that's why they talk about the global village. Globalization or the global village is meaning the same thing. This has sped up the process, so now that there is a global workforce and companies manufacturing global brands in the world, for example, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Microsoft. If you go to any country in the world, you are bound to see the signage or to look at adverts in magazines, billboards, TV, listen to the radio, even though you might not understand the local language of the new country. But these are synonymous with things that are global in their understanding and global in their experience. So people know what you're talking about when you talk about Coke or McDonald's or Microsoft. Globalization is made possible by all the advances in telecommunications. Now here we're talking about the internet and obviously the cell phone, telephonic communication has been remarkably sort of developed in the last 100 years or so. In 200-300 years of time, it might be completely different, and we'll have all sorts of new technology which allows us to communicate even faster or even more widespread, as it were. The faster, cheaper transport. It's so easy to get on an airplane and fly overseas now, and it doesn't cost that huge amount of money as what it was, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, for example. So prices have come down and people have started traveling more extensively. Then you get changes in the trade regulations and controls. That's very important. Visas have fallen away. You can visit many other countries in the world without having to pay a visa or getting permission prior to your journey to go and see something in another country, on another continent. And then also the emerging markets in the developing countries. For example, places like China has made globalization occur more frequently or grow at a rapid pace compared to what it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Okay, then also, if you look at the characteristics of globalization, we're talking about the fact that there's an increase in the international trade across the world. Globalization has made it easier for us to trade and to have relationships with other countries throughout the world. There's also a bigger role in the international organizations, places like the World Trade Organization or the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Those organizations or those international sort of companies or groups of companies and ideas and people, make it easier for us to communicate and to do all sorts of things. Thirdly, there's an increase in the practices of outsourcing where you get someone else to do something as part of your business, and the subcontracting of services or the manufacturing of your product in another country, for example. All those things have also added to the world becoming a smaller place and globalization being a larger phenomenon or an experience. More travel and tourism. People are going overseas and visiting new countries all the time, going to experience other people's heritage or cultures. We call that heritage tourism or cultural tourism. It's become a big fad in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. And people are traveling more easily and more sort of often, as it were, and so it's a smaller place. The world has become a global village. More immigration. People are moving overseas to go and live there for 5 years or for 10 years of their lives. Some people even immigrate and live for 6 months of the year where it's warmer, and then go back to where another country when it's obviously their summer and what used to be winter in their original country. And so they escape the seasons, as it were, because they want to be in a warmer climate. Particularly the older people who can afford that and are living now on their well-earned pensions and money that they've been putting aside all their lives. The spread of local consumer goods, food products and things that are popular or famous in a particular location or locality, that allows us to trade or allows for globalization to increase. Then there's been the increase in worldwide events, such as what we hosted here in 2010, the FIFA World Cup, the Soccer World Cup as it's called, where nations come together to play one another every 4 years on a global scale. That is a good example of globalization as well. And we'll see later in your exercises, there's a particular question about globalization and the context of the 2010 World Cup, which we'll look at in more detail. The development of global telecommunications and other infrastructure like the internet makes it so much easier to communicate. Skype, you can phone people that are living hundreds and hundreds of kilometers away or thousands of kilometers on the other side of the world and have a conversation with video input. You can see them, they can see you, and you converse and you discuss and you have a conversation. What has globalization done? It leads to the integration of all sorts of economic, political, and cultural things. Economically speaking, we know that multinational corporations like Vodacom or Voda World there in Midrand, right? And Vodafone is the international company, Vodacom is the local one, but now they've merged and they've bought into one another and they have equal share, as it were. Politically speaking, there's non-governmental organizations, NEPAD, SADC, the South African Development Community, all those sorts of agreements or political sorts of treaties, as it were, where we work together on a regional and eventually towards a global sort of scale when it comes to governance and economic as well as socio interactions. Then socially or culturally speaking, we've got American Western lifestyles becoming quite common, manners, fashion, practices, the English medium of communication, language, all of those become sort of acculturated or westernized with globalization. And obviously people want to have iPads, they want to have diesel jeans, all those sorts of brand names became very popular, and that shows us that the world is becoming globalized, or we are living in what used to be a planet is now a village with the easier way of communicating, easier way of traveling, easier way of buying and selling and trading with one another. All of this leads to tension between the very rich and developed countries of the world, right? So your north, or what we call the first world, as it were. If you want to also just make a note there, we're talking about the first world or the developed countries of the world, and then the poor nations of the world, what's known as the third world, or the developing nations, underdeveloped or less economically developed, right? LEDs, less economically developed countries, LEDCs as it's abbreviated, or the acronym for that. Countries like India, other places in Africa, South America, in other words, the global south or many regions in Asia is what we're talking about when we're talking about the poorer or the less developed, the underdeveloped world on a global scale. All right, now what are some of the good things about globalization? What is some of the advantages or the pluses? There's been more and more aid and direct investment to developing countries, which has helped them in their economic development. The richer nations have obviously invested more time and energy and money in building factories, in building all sorts of enterprises in poorer nations, providing jobs, providing employment, and allowing for economic growth of those lesser developed regions. That means there's more economic opportunities throughout the world on a global scale. And there's obviously opportunities for people to work and to advance their sort of economic position. Cheaper products become available. The more global something is, or the more people are consuming something, that makes it cheaper and obviously of benefit or of advantage to everyone. Products are also standardized and the quality of the stuff goes up or improves because you're producing it on mass. Mass production means it's cheaper, plus the quality can also be more carefully controlled or validated or looked after. Everyone shares in the benefits of technology. Well, everyone here, I'm just going to put in inverted commas because we'll talk about if it's rich or poor that are benefiting, but supposedly everyone has the benefits of cell phone technology, computers, all sorts of things related to the advances of modern technology and the silicon chip and telecommunications and all of that, the internet, etc., etc., etc. People gain access to goods and services from all over the world, and it's more readily available, again, through technology, and it's obviously cheaper many times as well. There is a greater variety of things. The variety or the variation of stuff that you can buy and sell or even experience as a tourist from all over the world becomes more readily available or easier. And then the last bullet here, benefits of globalization can trickle out from investment areas to improve the lives of many. There's lots of foreign investment in countries because you're going to earn things like pounds or dollars or yen. So obviously it's money that is stronger than your local currency, and it means economic improvement or economic benefits for the local country concerned. Governments can raise more money for healthcare and education, more important causes where obviously you need that investment or you need that concentration from the government to make things better for the locals or for the people. Okay, but everything is not always rosy, it's not always good. There's always a negative, or you can always argue the converse of something. So let's look at some of the disadvantages that I've listed here for you. What are some of the negatives or the bad things which are not so good for globalization? Okay, there's greater economic vulnerability between countries as a result of globalization. Have a look, for example, now what's going on in Europe with all that economic meltdown and the economic global recession, the crisis. Many of those countries who are reliant on one currency, the euro, are now suffering as a result. Greece is supposedly bankrupt. Other countries are struggling on a daily basis. And even on the news today, if you were listening, they were talking about the economic sort of issues or problems that countries are facing in Europe because of the fact of being on one currency. So when there's a slump or someone suffers, then everyone sort of gets dragged down at the same time. If one country suffers an economic slump, many other countries will do so too. Thus, lack of responsibility, multinational companies in place of independent governments become responsible for the decisions about where to set up factories, where to close them down, which countries to invest in, and how they will treat their workers, as well as all sorts of other things related to rights and your job sort of satisfaction. Secondly, there is strong competition between producers as a result of globalization. The fact that something can be bought or sold across the world means you really have to work hard to promote your product, to market it, to advertise correctly, and then your sales and your success of your business is dependent on all sorts of other factors beyond your control. So it's quite a very sort of risk-orientated environment. Unequal distribution of wealth. Remember, we'll talk about that. Some get rich or richer, others get poorer. There's a gap which widens your developed and your developing countries. The developing countries seem to grow and advance, and the developing countries remain behind or remain stagnant and become poorer or struggle even more. International organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF stands for International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organizations start to apply Western standards to the non-Western countries. Laws, rules, and regulations that are Western in origin become the norm, and the standards by which things are governed or controlled by. Vulnerability is a big disadvantage from globalization. The power of multinational companies can leave governments and workers vulnerable. Basically, big, rich countries like Coca-Cola or others can decide how much people get paid or don't get paid, or the benefits that they have or don't have, sick leave, all sorts of things can be governed from outside sources and not by the local sort of regulations or statutory bodies. Then there's also the poor. They suffer the most. The world's poorest do not see much benefit from globalization, and in some cases people argue that it makes their position worse. They get it sort of taken advantage of, or they don't see any benefits from that. Cultural loss or sameness. People say everyone loses their religion or their language or their culture, their heritage as it were, because the presence of global brands like Nike, or think of any multinational company, and the sophisticated advertising that goes with that to sell them, makes every street in the world start to look the same. People everywhere, if they can, start buying the same burgers. They want to wear the same clothes. Gap, right? Remember the shorts in that little cartoon of the guy, the boy. He had a Gap short trousers on, or a pair of shorts. So everyone starts to want to look the same, listen to the same music, watch the same movies, visit the same websites. Think of Facebook. It's a brilliant example of globalization. Right, so let's have a look at how would this sort of question be asked of you in the exam. Okay, again, this is a past paper from a matric exam 1 or 2 years ago, and this is our first question in that section. Remember, section B of your final exam is going to be question 3 or 4. It's all the human geography that you've studied: economic, urban and rural settlements, settlement geography, political geography, all of that stuff you've done in earlier grades. Even way back in grade 10 or grade 11, some of the stuff you were learning there can come up again. So make sure you keep track of all your previous work and you haven't thrown all your geography books away. This question says, refer to figure 1 below, which shows the story of Oman, a Pakistani, and his relationship with globalization. Answer the questions that follow. All right. Omar lives on the outskirts of Salkot in Pakistan. In that city and the villages around that, they make 75% of the world's hand-stitched footballs, right? Which is the same thing as a soccer ball in our sort of local understanding of football and soccer. They produce an amazing 35 million footballs a year. Now that sounds phenomenal. 35 million soccer balls, and just think of where all those soccer balls are going and who's using them. It's a multi-million rand, pound, dollar sort of industry, as it were. He says, I have been sewing football since I was 8 years old. I don't like it much, but I have to do it because I have to support my family. I work in a stitching center. I start at 7 in the morning and end at 8 o'clock in the evening. I do 4 footballs a day, and I earn 24 rand per day. Imagine working for 24 rand a day. Some of you might have part-time jobs. I'm sure they're not paying you 24 rand even in an hour, but he's earning 24 rand in a day. That's shocking. He goes on and he says, I saw a World Cup match in South Africa on TV in my uncle's house. The football could have, it should be H-A-V-E, been once sewed by me, but nobody at the match knew about me. So he's saying he could have been the one that made that football, and here's this famous sort of game being watched by millions and millions of people, and he's the one that could have stitched that football together in its final stages of production, and no one even knows who he is. Okay, this little cartoon here basically shows why Omar is paid so little. This is what happens. The British company supplies footballs. It gets them made, and then it sells them to clubs and sports shops at a profit. In the sort of business room, the CEO or the financial director says to the other guy, we must make more profit. The less it pays for the footballs, the more profit this company is going to make. So the company starts to search the world for a factory, cheap labor, and all sorts of other factors where they can make this more cheaply. Right, so let's have a look at some of these questions. Question number 1 says, now remember, there's usually a preamble or a little introductory paragraph to every section or to every question. read the paragraph, look for keywords so that you know what concepts are they probably going to be asking you about, or what ideas are they testing you on in this question. Right, so the preamble says, 2010 has been a historic year for South Africa due to the hosting of the FIFA Soccer World Cup. Right, so that's when we hosted the World Cup here in South Africa, very big, major success, etc. The manufacturing of soccer balls, or footballs as they are called above, in countries far away from where they are used is an example of globalization. So here's the concept. Globalization is what we're being tested on, and here comes your first question for 2 marks. Remember, the first 1 or 2 questions are your recall memory type of questions. So those are things you would have had to study, definitions, being able to say something in a one-word answer sometimes. So it's just simple recall information, and hopefully you've done your studying properly. 1.1 says, define the term globalization. Remember, we are looking at things like task words or question words so that we know what to do. And then we're also looking at things like your mark allocation. How much information am I going to give to earn the marks that they want me to do? And remember, like I've said before, in geography, you are earning double marks for thinking. So something that you've had to process or engage with, think about, elaborate on, justify, or further discuss or describe in more detail is going to earn you double the marks for what they want. So for 2 marks, how would you define globalization? Right, you start off by saying globalization is, right, you take the word globalization and you start your answer off like that. Globalization is the process whereby the world is a interconnected place. Right. Social, economic, political, and cultural activities are shared more readily by millions of people. Right, so what we've said here basically in this answer, millions of people can know something by watching it on the news or clicking on the internet, checking in, logging into their Facebook page, etc. And they are learning all sorts of socio-economic, political and cultural things by being in a social network. That is an example of globalization. The process where the world has become a smaller place through the increase of technology or the sharing of ideas through all sorts of mediums such as the internet or TV, radio, telecommunications, etc., etc. So we want 2 ideas there for 2 marks, and how they're going to mark your answers as follows. They will look for your first idea. Globalization is the process whereby the world is an interconnected place. That will get you 1 mark. And then socioeconomically or politically, culturally speaking, the activities people do, the information they have access to or know about, the large nature of the word global, that everyone is involved, millions of people can know this or do this or have this at their fingertips, is the other idea here for the 2nd mark. So you get 2 marks. 1 times 2 is 2 marks there for question 1. Then question 1.2 says, give 2 reasons, right? You must give 2 reasons, otherwise you're not going to earn the 4 marks. Give 2 reasons why this multinational corporation uses less developed countries to produce their soccer balls. Okay, why does this company in England or in the United Kingdom, wherever they're based, use a country where there is a poorer scenario with lots of laborers, etc., making these soccer balls on a long production line, as it were, and they produce 500 or 600 soccer balls in a day? Remember, this boy himself is responsible for 4 soccer balls by the end of the day, and he earns his 24 rand. He works from 7 in the morning all the way through to 8 o'clock at night. Not very nice working conditions. Right, so the question is saying why, or give 2 reasons why, this multinational company uses less developed countries to produce their soccer balls. Now remember, we've studied, if we've done our learning properly, they rely on the cheapness thereof. If you remember that little cartoon, if we just go back 1 step, even if you can't remember what you've studied properly, look for the clues here, because a lot of the time the answers are in the visuals or in the information that they are giving you to work with, and that'll help you answer the question. Remember this little cartoon I spoke you through a little earlier? They want to produce the product at a cheaper rate, so they've got to find cheaper labor where they don't have to pay the people as much to work, etc., to make the product more viable or more profitable. So to answer this question here, for 4 marks, you're going to say something like, in less developed countries, the raw materials, right? And remember, by raw material, I'm talking about things like the leather that the ball is made out of, or the stuff that they put inside the ball that they process and sort of use for the inner parts of the football, etc., is obviously cheaper. Whereas if they bought that same leather or that same stuff in England, it would be more expensive. So go to a country where they have prices that are lower for the good that you want to use, you pay less for it, and it's obviously better for your business in the long run. Okay, 1 point there, 2 marks. So the less developed countries, your raw materials are cheaper, 2 marks. Also, remember this is a 2 times 2 question. You can speak about the cheap labor. In this country, for example, people are unemployed. There might be too many people in the village for the amount of work available, so they are prepared to work for lower wages or lower salaries just to have a job. And they are prepared to earn 24 Rand in a day so that they can at least buy bread and milk for the day and at least support their family in some respect. So cheaper labor there is your other idea for 2 marks. You can also say things like, in these countries, the laws protecting labor are less stringent, right, or less equally applied, as it were. In many countries in the world, the constitutions or the legislation is not as strong, and it cannot protect the people and the workers as much as it does in other countries like ours, for example, or in America or in England, Britain, those places of the world. And so obviously many countries take advantage of that, or companies rather take advantage of that, and they go to these places where it's cheaper labor and cheaper raw materials, and they can exploit the people without being exposed or caught, or it's not a major sort of social or environmental injustice issue, and it doesn't make it to the news, etc., etc. That's why they go to these places out of the way. You could also talk about things like unemployment. Unemployment is higher in the developing world, so obviously you're going to find cheaper labor as well because people are willing to work for less than others. And you can talk about manual skills. You need people that have the skills to make the football or the soccer ball in this scenario, and to find those you would go to places where those skills exist or where people know how to do that work. Right, question 1.3. Now it's getting many more marks here. 3 times 2. Remember, you need to give 3 ideas here that you've explained or elaborated or put out there nicely so that you can earn double the marks. Explain how. There's your task word. Explain how the hosting of the Soccer World Cup in South Africa has promoted globalization in South Africa, specifically in our country. Okay, the first thing it did is that there was an influx of tourists. Now the word influx means more than usual, a huge sort of gathering, a storming of people, as it were, right? Influx of tourists from different parts of the world, that allowed us to earn foreign exchange. Okay, people paid in foreign currency for things like their flight ticket here, their accommodation in the hotel at the waterfront, the taxi who took them to the stadium there in Greenpoint, the food they bought, the hot dogs during the halfway sort of mark or half time. All of that adds up, and people are spending their valuable dollars or yen or pounds or whatever foreign currency you're talking about, and that means that we're earning more money for the country. Secondly, it boosted local business. Right? Local businesses were able to sell their products because there's more customers here now all of a sudden than there usually are. And with all these visitors or these tourists of the world, there was a greater market or a more scope to sell your goods and your products. You can talk about foreign trade. Partnerships were established. After the World Cup, or as a result of the World Cup, new partnerships or agreements were signed between our country and other countries where these people were coming from for us to barter and to sell and to trade goods in the future. You can also talk about South Africa features more prominently in the global village. Remember this global village idea that the world is now a smaller place because you can know about an earthquake on the other side of the world which happened 2 hours ago, for example, by just switching on the news or listening to the radio. That is the world becoming a smaller place. Globalization, the transfer of information and technology and ideas and goods and services, faster, quicker, more widespread on a planetary scale. That is what we're talking about when we're dealing with globalization. So you need 3 ideas here to get your 3 times 2, 6 marks. And this is for question 1.3. Question 1.4 goes on a little bit and says, give 2 reasons for the passage, to prove that Omar is exploited as a worker. How do we know that Omar doesn't like what he's doing or that he is exploited as a worker? What reasons were given in the cartoon or in the preamble? So if we go back there, we have a look at that information we should have read earlier and engaged with for a few minutes. Always read and think through and look at the information you've got before you start answering your questions to engage with and to deal with the material, and that will help you give some sort of feedback and information from what they want you to do. Okay, remember he says he works hard. He starts here at 7 o'clock in the morning. Where was that? Let's have a look here, this paragraph. I start at 7 in the morning and I end at 8 o'clock at night. That is a long day, right? Most legislation in this country says you can't work for more than 8 hours a day, and then even then you must also have your hour's lunch and your 2 tea breaks in a day, 15 minutes in the morning, 15 minutes in the afternoon. This poor boy is working the whole day. He probably gets half an hour lunch somewhere in between 7 in the morning and 7 o'clock at night. That's more than 12 hours in a day that he's working. Also remember, he only earns 24 Rand for the whole day that he's worked. 12 hours divided by 24, he's earning like 2 Rand an hour or something ridiculous. Right, so to answer that question, we're going to go to question 1.4 and we're going to say 2 things there for our 4 marks. Omar works from 7 o'clock in the morning all the way through to 8 o'clock at night. Right, that is a very long day. So he must be tired, and it's not very humane or nice to work so long. I mean, imagine if you had to be at school from 7 in the morning till 8 o'clock at night, right? Some of you complain that you only get to go home at 3 o'clock, but this is a hugely long day. 2 o'clock. 2 marks. Listen to me, 2 o'clock. Then the second reason here, he only earns a terrible or a measly 24 Rand for a day's work. That is shocking. That is very exploitative. That is exploitation at its worst. Okay, so you need 2 ideas there for 2 marks, and that will give you your 4 marks there, 2 times 2. Okay, we could also even say here, to get some marks, that he is unhappy by the fact that no one even knew he made those soccer balls when he was watching the World Cup. So those sorts of ideas will even get you good marks, because the examiner can see that you're thinking ahead, and that from a psychological sort of point of view, he's upset that he hasn't been acknowledged for making that football as well. If you Google the word globalization on YouTube, you'll get quite a few clips that pop up immediately, which defines globalization as well as gives you a sense of people's opinions or views. Some say why they think it's good, others say why they think it's bad, and you can make up your own mind by watching 2 or 3 of those clips once you've Googled or YouTubed this concept or this idea. We're going to have a quick ad break now, and when we return, we'll carry on. Welcome back. For our last segment of today's work, we're going to be looking at food security, or what's commonly called in many textbooks as food insecurity. Now, you mustn't confuse the two. They're not different things. It's the same concept or the same idea, except they've just related it or stated it in a different way. If in your textbook they are talking about food security, we basically mean, have people got enough food and access to food, and is there enough food available for people to eat? Whereas other textbooks will talk about it in the negative, and they will talk about food insecurity, or a country struggling with or from food insecurity, not having enough food and there's not enough to eat, plus people don't have access to it or they can't afford the food in the first place. So this idea of food security or insecurity is the same concept or idea, it's just stated in a different way. Right, let's have a look at some of the key concepts or the main ideas that we're going to look at in this section. In this session, we will consider the following. We will look again at defining what is food security, or definitions more broadly, and many of the terminology or the words that we use in the context of looking at food security or food insecurity is quite significant or important. Things like climate change, genetically modified foods, drought, famine, starvation, malnutrition, all these terms and words you need to be familiar with or study. It might be a good idea to get yourself a good geography dictionary from the library that you can also study from or use as you're preparing this section for the exam. The second thing is we're going to look at what causes or what factors contribute to food security or insecurity. Why is there enough or not enough food, and what leads to those sorts of scenarios or factors in a country? And then how do we measure or the levels of insecurity or food security, and then what do we do to prevent food insecurity? What sort of solutions or suggestions can we give, or do countries necessarily have to come up with so that they prevent this scenario from unfolding in their nation states? Right, so definitions, the problems, and what solutions or suggestions are necessary is what we're going to focus on in this session. If we start with definitions, here's the definition of what we mean by the term food security or food insecurity. Remember, it's the same concept or the same idea, except you can state it in the positive or you can state it in the negative context. Food security is defined as the availability of, whether or not there is food, and access to the food. That's the first two important things. Is there food? Have we grown enough as a country, maize, for example, or millies, or wheat, or whatever crop it is you're talking about that feeds people? Remember, a staple crop or a staple diet is the thing that most people eat, or is the easiest and the cheapest crop to grow for a particular country or nation. That's the first issue. Is there enough of it? The availability, number one. Secondly, do we have access, or are people able to buy the food? Can they afford the food? By access, we don't just mean is the food available or readily there to be bought. We mean, can people afford it? Can they pay the price that it costs, etc.? And then is there enough of it? There's a double meaning to access here in this definition as well. So it is the availability of and access of food, and it is important, food security is important for healthy and productive living. For people to be healthy, they have to eat enough. The nutritional value of food has got to be good or of a high standard and quality to make sure that people are healthy and able to live sustainable and productive lives. On the other hand, food insecurity, if we look at it from the negative side of defining what we mean, food insecurity is the lack of basic food, not enough of it. It ranges from chronic hunger and malnutrition to famine and starvation. Here are those words that I said to you a moment ago in my little preamble to this section. Make sure you know what these words mean. We all know what it means to be hungry when you haven't eaten enough on a day and you're starving by the time it's now netball or athletics or rugby or hockey, whatever you're playing in the afternoon. That is hunger. But malnutrition is when you're not getting enough minerals and nutrients from your food because you're not eating enough or you're not eating the right types of food, so that you're physically malnourished. That's where the word malnourished comes from. Malnutrition or malnourished, right, means basically the same thing, except obviously if you look at it semantically or the grammar thereof, the one might be a verb, the other a noun, etc., etc. Famine, not having enough food. Country suffering, people the country is in a famine, they don't have enough food to feed the population. And then starvation, basically where people starve and you see those terrible pictures of people that are skeletal or they've got no more sort of body fat on their bodies and they look like living skeletons. That's what we mean by starvation in that context over there. Now, the world's food security is threatened by things like climate change, where we can talk about, as an example of that, global warming, El Nino, drought. All those sorts of things can cause food insecurity or food security to be compromised. Things like oil prices and the farming of crops for biofuels rather than growing them for feeding purposes, those sorts of issues can lead towards or cause food security issues or food insecurity to be a problem in a country. Oil prices are important because obviously that determines how much we pay for things. The transport of food obviously influences its cost, and so when oil prices go up or when petrol goes up, then obviously food prices also go up, and then that makes it more difficult for poorer people to buy the basics or the necessities, as it were, and obviously they become exposed or vulnerable to food insecurity, or food security becomes a problem for people. Global organizations that help to provide less developed countries with food include things or places like the World Health Organization, the WHO, the Red Cross Society, as well as the United Nations Organization. They've got all sorts of programs. Remember UNEP, as well as their food, the FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization of the World. All those sorts of multinational companies and world organizations have a role to play in helping prevent food insecurity. They provide aid. Food parcels get delivered to places where there's been a drought or a flood or some sort of natural disaster like earthquakes or volcanic eruptions, and obviously people's crops were destroyed and there won't be enough food for that year to feed the population, as it were. Food insecurity is worst in developing countries like in Africa and in Asia, where we have the sort of frequent occurrence of natural disasters or hazards that hit them, like tropical cyclones or floods, earthquakes and other problems like that. Heat waves, all sorts of things can cause crop failure. For food insecurity at a national level, this is the next bullet over here, right? Food insecurity at a national level, any country or a country in the world must be able to produce, store, distribute, and import enough food so that it meets the needs of its basic population or people. So growing of crops, storing of crops, distributing it or spreading it out in the countryside during the course of time through the various provinces that the food has to go to, as well as the importing of food if we don't have enough for that particular year. That's what determines whether or not a country is food secure or food insecure in a particular year or given period of time. In South Africa, interestingly enough, at least 1/3 of our population does not have enough food. So 1/3 of South Africa, 33% of our people don't have enough food, or they are food secure, vulnerable, or food insecure. And the wealthier provinces, places like Gauteng, for example, is more food secure than poorer provinces like the Eastern Cape or the Northern Cape, for example. Again, rural areas in South Africa usually have the least food security, and that seems ironic because rural areas are where we grow the food, so why would they have the sort of problem of not having enough food? That sounds very weird or bizarre. But remember, the rural areas produce the food, and that food gets bought or it pays for jobs, and people get paid for growing the food, etc. So they don't necessarily keep the food for themselves. They sell it to make money to buy their own food. And in that way, very often the consumption or the supply obviously determines the demand, and they get left with not enough. And there's not a balance, or there's no check and balances between the two processes, and then they can be left with not enough food at the end of the day. The last bullet here on this page is very important. Poverty is a big reason, or is always linked to food insecurity as an issue. Hungry people are less able to work, so they remain poor, which leads to more hunger. Now, in your textbooks, they talk about the vicious cycle of deprivation, and this is what we're talking about here. If they're poor to start off with, right, they can't grow enough food because they can't afford to buy the seeds. They don't grow enough of it. It's not profitable. Their yields are not enough, etc. They earn less money for the little that they have produced. They get even more poorer, and so the cycle of depravity or the cycle of poverty becomes perpetual and it increases, and people get sucked down into this repetitive process of just getting more and more hungry, more and more poor, more and more desperate, as it were. Think of yourself as well. On a day where you haven't eaten enough, or you forgot to have breakfast before you went to school, you don't concentrate as well, you don't do as well in your test that day, because your body needs food for energy. Your body needs that food that you've digested to make your systems work and your brain to function and your thinking to happen coherently and at a fast enough pace, etc., etc. So if you don't eat enough, you don't do well. You must imagine what it's like for people that are hungry on a daily basis, trying to live or trying to work. It doesn't happen very easily, or it's not good for them. Right, let's have a look at the first major issue, factors. What factors or what reasons contribute to food insecurity? What is it that causes people not to have enough food, or food security to be a problem? Poverty is always linked to food insecurity because people are often caught in what is called the hunger-poverty trap. Little of what I was saying earlier in that cycle of deprivation. Hunger leads to poverty because a hungry person is less able to compete for work. They are tired, undernourished, or even very often sick or ill, and they can't get their job, or they can't go to work, so they get laid off, they get retrenched, they lose their job, they become unemployed. And then the whole process perpetuates itself, and it gets worse and worse and worse. Because of this, a hungry person remains poor, remains hungry, loses their job, or whatever the case may be, and food security becomes an issue. Secondly, poverty is only one reason. Food insecurity is also often blamed on natural disasters or hazards, but it is generally a social and a political problem. Remember, society and the problems of our world, economically speaking, relates to poverty, unemployment, overpopulation, all those big issues that you learn about in population geography even, which in an economic context, in economic or human geography, becomes quite prevalent in our studies and understanding of certain ideas or concepts. If we look at some further factors, here's another one. Physically speaking, the physical environment would be a third reason or a third factor. Things that lead to food insecurity could be your common problems like droughts and floods and outbreaks of diseases, things like malaria and cholera, TB, all those sorts of things can cause people to be unhealthy, not go to work, not be productive, lose their jobs, and then the whole cycle gets unbalanced and food insecurity becomes an issue or a problem. Land degradation, like soil erosion, is a good example, and soil infertility will obviously lead to the less production of crops or the less production of food, and that will increase the levels of insecurity or drop the food security substantially. For example, if you have a look here, it says Mozambique often suffers natural disasters such as cyclones. Yeah, I'm talking about tropical cyclones. Remember, in your climatology section, they're also known as hurricanes in America or typhoons in the Far East. A tropical cyclone, that very powerful, destructive sort of storm that's on quite a regional sort of scale, can wipe out entire crops. A whole year of growing something can be destroyed by the heavy torrential rainfall or the flooding that comes as a result of that storm as well. And if you lose like acres, hectares and hectares and hectares of food, obviously that's going to translate into thousands and thousands of people not being able to eat for that month or for those couple of months in that particular year. Flooding and droughts are other examples of climate change, where obviously the change in climate is going to affect food production or the growing of crops. Floods destroy these crops, they drown livestock, sheep, cattle, goats. They drown in these floods because they cannot swim as well as humans. They get washed away, transport routes get damaged, highways get sort of eaten away by heavy rain or fast-moving water, and that costs money, and money obviously spent on that means that you don't import enough food. If you don't import enough food as a result of paying for all these extra costs, then obviously your food security becomes an issue or a crisis or a problem. Then there are also other factors, socio-economically, politically speaking, that can cause food insecurity or cause food security to be compromised or a problem. Think of things like a shortage of arable land. Remember, in South Africa, we've only got a very small percentage of our soil that is arable. In other words, what you can grow on. Arable means Where will crops grow? Where has it got enough minerals and nutrients and sort of fertilized aspects of the soil that allows for crops to grow or to be productive? Secondly, the replacement of subsistence farming with cash crops or commercial farming is a big problem as well. People become dependent on the sort of commercialization of farming, and that becomes problematic. High production costs. It costs a lot of money to produce food, and that makes food more expensive. And for people that are poor or struggling, that can't afford that, they're going to start to experience starvation by not eating enough every day or eating only every third or fourth day, and that becomes a big issue. Foreign competition. Some countries can produce food cheaper. They can grow crops cheaper, and they will sell to us at a cheaper price than what we even can get for exporting that same good. That becomes a huge sort of problem, and it can lead to food insecurity. Wars and conflicts, things like civil war or political protest, right? Or think of things like what happened in countries in years gone by where there's genocide or the killing of people as a result of political skirmishes or conflict. That obviously means people are not planting, they're not growing, they're not tilling the soil, they're not involved in the daily production of food, and that can escalate into weeks, if not months, if not years of production loss, and that can lead to all sorts of problems with food security as well. Poor infrastructure. What do we mean by poor infrastructure? Things like lack of farming equipment, or you're not using the well-developed rail networks that we spoke about in another session previously when we looked at trade and transport. You don't have all those benefits to transport your goods or to get your products to harbors and coastlines for trade. That can cause food insecurity as well. Overcrowding, right, of land means that you use it up and you lose its fertility or its capacity to grow as many crops or to feed as many sheep or to sustain as much of a herd of cattle as possible. So that can lead to food insecurity as well. Lack of funding for agricultural research, not having the capacity or the scientific expertise to grow sustainably, to farm intelligently, to farm in a scientifically productive and useful way. And then things like lack of capital or money to invest in supplies, seeds, machinery, tractors, harvesters, things that help us to farm more easily or more productively, profitably, commercially speaking as well. That can lead to food insecurity. So food insecurity is a problem as a result of all of these issues that I've outlined here already. Right? We've had 1, 2, 3, 4 issues so far that all account for why we don't have enough food as a result of various problems or various issues. Okay, so what is being done? What are the solutions or what are the suggestions? What are the ways that we solve these problems? If you have a look at this next slide here, we talk about measures to prevent or to caution or to stop food insecurity from happening. Now in South Africa, there are 2 approaches to address the threat or the problem of food insecurity. The first one is the government aiming or maintaining and trying to increase the ability of South Africa to meet its national food requirements. Remember, there's something like 49 million people in South Africa these days. And how we feed our population and the demand that is increased as a result of higher population levels. The government has thought about 3 or 4 ways of doing that. So here are some of them listed here on the page. We've got making sure that the domestic agriculture continues to produce what is needed. Domestic means local or inland, right? So we have to make sure that the amount of food that we grow on all the farms in every single province in South Africa meets the basic requirements, the demand, as it were, of how many people, right, this word over here, how many people need to be fed. We must produce enough food to feed those 49 million people that exist in South Africa as our population. Secondly, importation or importing foods that cannot be produced in South Africa must be done at a very cost-effective way or in a cost-effective way. We shouldn't be importing all sorts of expensive things that many people can't afford to buy in the first place. We should keep it sustainable, we should keep it rational, we should keep it cleverly or intelligently maintained. Thirdly, trying to eradicate, do away with inequality and poverty. Poverty is a perpetual global issue or a major global problem. Getting jobs, getting people fed, keeping people happy with the basic sorts of necessities and ideals is what that point is talking to or all about over there, number 3. And then the last bullet point here, number 4, exporting food excesses at good prices. If we grow more than what we need in a particular year, we can sell that surplus, right? Another word for excess is surplus. Selling those surpluses at a profit or a higher price, a good price, is what the government could be doing to try and improve our revenue from the exportation of some of our crops or some of our food that we produce in the country. Right, so here are some other sort of ways of doing it. Remember, on the one hand, we wanted to, the first approach was this maintaining of or increasing our ability to meet our own needs. The second one is the further eradication of poverty or doing away with societal issues like inequality or injustice, those sorts of issues where people are suffering as a result of not enough food. So what can the government, or what does the government hope to do? The first thing it wants to do or hope to do is to introduce rural development schemes that include skills training, capacitate people with a skill, training, education, being able to do something with your hands to earn a living, to make money, to keep yourself sustained, and funding of farms that obviously can be run by people, right, in groups. So in Australia, you might have heard, not Australia, sorry, Israel, you might have heard of the concept like a kibbutz, although kibbutzes happen all over the world, even in Australia, I'm sure, where people come together and they work communally together. They all benefit from working together, putting in the labor, the effort. Everyone pulls their weight. They all work together, as it were. It's a team effort. And that is the sort of thing they can start developing in a rural context. That's what we're talking about when we talk about this idea of a rural development scheme in South Africa. The buzzword in South Africa, sustainable development, sustainability, all of those sort of variations of the word sustain, to look after or to have for future. Promoting sustainable agricultural practices is a big policy in South Africa, and the government is spending millions of rands a year looking into research or ways of growing things more cleverly, more sustainably, so that they are resistant to climate change, or they're resistant to pests that are happening more often, locusts, diseases, microbial sort of parasites and things that attack the plants. So that idea of promoting a sustainable way of agriculture and producing the same but cleverly or cheaply is a big focus on the government's input or policies. Then they want to address and resolve issues of land ownership. Who owns the land? Righting political or sort of historical wrongs by getting people that used to live on the land, their traditional sort of ancestors, from a cultural heritage point of view, allowing people to have ownership or have access to that land in the first place is another way of ensuring that more people farm or more people engage again in primary economic activities like farming or agriculture again. Helping rural households to produce their own food, concentrating on subsistence farming again in South Africa, right? This idea of allowing a farmer to grow his own food, but then also to sell the surplus or to sell the extra that he produces after he's met his own family needs or her own family needs. Many females farm these days as well, not just a male-dominated activity. And then selling that surplus crops or selling that surplus produce for money or for economic gain to producers like people that buy the things like Pick n Pay and your various retail shops. Creating job opportunities. Jobs is a big buzzword, right? More people can earn money from the agricultural sector. They can earn a living, have a livelihood, etc. that is something to solve food insecurity, because you'll produce more food, you'll have people more economically active and participating in the local economy. Improving nutrition. Now, this is a very debatable one, and that's where we'll talk about things just now like genetically modified foods and using science to make things grow quicker or faster or last longer, that they don't spoil or basically rot as fast as what they would have if they're not in a fridge, etc., etc. Improving food emergency management systems. This talks to things like aid, providing food parcels, all those sorts of things. That happens once people are exposed to a lack of food through things like climate change or a natural hazard like a cyclone having occurred. Going and providing food parcels and food supply to people that need it when some sort of disaster has struck. That is another way of dealing with food insecurity. But obviously that deals with it in the short term, and you'll see many of these other things I've discussed here prior to this slide is looking or trying to address the long-term issues or the long-term side of the problem towards food security or food insecurity as an issue. Right, here we've got some specific examples of how we prevent food insecurity. And you can see here the government is trying to develop something called the National Food Fortification Program, or I think it's abbreviated as NFFFP. This is a program or a government initiative which is looking at the fact that there is a lack of essential vitamins and minerals in most of people's diets, which causes deficiency diseases. We get sick more often because we're not getting the right amount of vitamins and the various types of vitamins that we should be getting from the foods that we are eating. The minerals that are in a lot of the food has become sort of compromised or not as well as what it should have been in the past. And when you look at the poor or people that are poverty stricken, they are especially vulnerable to these dietary deficiencies, or they suffer the most at the hands of these deficient minerals or vitamin sort of diseases as a result of the wrong diet or a lack of these things in their diet. The food fortification program is the additional or the way of essential micronutrients into foods that government is trying to get back. And we're looking at things like the staple foods in South Africa, right? Maize is a staple diet, being fortified or grown in such a way that it provides the amount of minerals and nutrients that you and I need for our daily existence and the sort of energy requirements that our bodies have for us to be productive and sustainable as individuals in our work, in our studies, and in our sort of engagement of the economy on a day-to-day basis. Then there's this whole issue, and this is the very debatable sort of question, right? Do we genetically modify the foods? You'll see they talk about GM foods. They're abbreviated as GM later on here in the notes. Genetically modified crops are foods or crops or produce that has been genetically modified at a cellular level. So scientists, botanists have basically gone, and people in your sort of chemistry field have looked at the very basic structure of a plant or the genetic sort of makeup of crops, and by altering it at that microscopic biological level, they do things to the plants or animals. You'll see animals is included in this definition over here. That basically makes them stronger, more resistant to pests, produce quicker, more often on a larger scale, etc. Genetically modified plants have been engineered, right, scientifically engineered, so that they contain more than one foreign gene. And it's this genetic influence or this genetic modification of a plant at that level which improves their growing properties, such as their resistance to pests and how fast they can produce something. For example, an insect-resistant GM plant produces a protein toxin in itself, right, at a cellular level that kills pests that eat it, such as caterpillars, for example. So as soon as they start eating on the leaf of the maize or whatever, or the crop, they will physically die as a result of genetic influences or impetuses and they won't eat the mealie, or they won't eat the plant to such an extent that it dies and it doesn't produce the mealie at the end of the day. So there are advantages and there are disadvantages. Let's have a look at some of those very quickly. The advantages are that you get more. The increased yields means that you can grow more of something on a larger scale, and it takes a shorter time period to do that. Supposedly they are better quality. Now that is argued by people that like the organic movement rather. They say everything should be organic and not influenced by genetically modified sort of processes, but that you should keep everything natural or organic. And that is what's good for us. That's what provides the right levels of minerals and nutrients in our food. We shouldn't be meddling from a technological or a scientific sort of point of view in the growing of crops or in the production of food like we do. But many sort of supporters of GM foods, because remember this is the advantages of genetically modified crops, they say it's better quality, it lasts longer, the tomatoes are bigger, they're more nutritious, they don't go off as quickly if you leave them in your fruit basket at home. They last for 3 weeks at a time instead of rotting after maybe 2 or 4 days, etc. Also, many people say that genetically modified or GM foods are more environmentally friendly because from a pest control point of view, farmers don't have to use pesticides, or they use lesser or fewer pesticides, and that's a good thing for the environment. But again, we have all sorts of questions here, and you can make up your own mind here, because it's your opinion also at the end of the day that counts. Is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? People that are against genetically modified crops, or what are the disadvantages of GM foods, they are saying that GM seed is expensive. And in some cases, if you do your research on the internet, there are only a handful of companies that control the seeds of the world and for various crops and for various products. And if you look at those, they become the monopolies. They control everything, right? Who they sell to, how much they can charge for that seed, all of that becomes a very economic and sort of debatable issue. Who has the power by controlling the seeds and the selling of the seeds and the price of the seeds? It boils down to a handful of companies, 5 or 6 companies in the world that have that sort of control. The public is also very wary of genetically modified foods. People are worried about genetically modified foods because obviously we can't prove if it's good or bad. Not enough research has been done to prove if GM foods are responsible for more cancers that we get in our bodies, stomach, liver, kidney. Because remember, your food is processed by your body, and all the extra stuff that we're putting into food, even at a genetic level, can maybe affect our genetic sort of makeup and our cells in a way, and make us get cancer more often or suffer from all sorts of diseases and ailments. That hasn't been proved, and the research still needs to be done. So there's lots of unknowns here. You'll see in the last bullet there, it talks about the impact of GM plants, genetically modified plants, on the environment and human health is unknown. We are also part of the environment. It's not just the physical environment that we're talking about here, but the effect of GM on people is another issue, as well as just Mother Nature and crops and soil and water and all those sorts of issues that are related to the physical or the natural environment. So let's have a look at how would you be asked a question about food security. Okay, here is question 2 for today. The first one we were looking at, remember earlier, was dealing with globalization. Now this part of the exam, or this specific question, was taken from a past paper where they're focusing your attention on food security or insecurity as a concept or an idea. Again, remember to look at the preamble, read the information, study the visuals, look at the sort of graphical or visual data that you are presented with, and then engage with that material or look at that, think about it, read it carefully before you start answering the questions, and spend a bit of time mulling over what it's all about or what it's saying. So here question 2 says, read the extract below and answer the questions that follow, right? Remember, if something like this is there, I would read it once or twice just to make sure I've understood the content and what it is that's being communicated to me over there as well. Okay, the heading says here, climate change threatens food security in southern Africa. So there's our big ideas: food security, climate change, and then here we've got a region of the world, Southern Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, right? Basically, the bottom half of Africa is being spoken about in this little headline. This looks like it is a newspaper clipping or a newspaper article, so let's read through and see what it's all about. Climate change has led to a drastic drop in agricultural production in Malawi. Now, there is an important point. Maybe with your ruler and your highlighter or your pen, underline some points as you go along in your reading. Climate change has led to a drastic drop in agricultural production in Malawi and other southern African countries. Okay, but they've isolated Malawi here, so maybe that is relevant. This is the conclusion of delegates at the December 2005 Conference on Climate Change. Remember, every year the world meets at the United Nations to discuss major global issues or problems. And climate change is an issue that has been on the agenda for the last 5 to 10 years on a global scale. So this is obviously the Global Climate Change Conference that was held that particular year, 2005. Remember, this year we are hosting or last year we hosted rather in Durban. This year it's going overseas to another country, I think Denmark again, where they're going to gather all the world leaders come together and sit, ministers of environmental affairs particularly, to come and discuss issues around climate change or global environmental problems. Land's Secretary George Mokindwa of Malawi says that Malawians are no longer able to feed themselves. Remember, this is the year 2005. Many people, and this is a quote from his speech or his reading of a document at the conference, many people are surviving on wild foods, and half of the population faces starvation and needs food aid. They need help to eat. The article continues, in southern Zambia, another African country, the food crisis has hit, or the food crises, that's plural, right, has hit, and 400,000 villagers are starving. At the moment, Zambia is importing maize, the country's staple food, from its South African neighbor. Small-scale farmers in countries such as Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Zambia are more affected by the periodic droughts than large-scale commercial farmers. Okay, I've underlined Zimbabwe there because it's a new mention of another country. So far we've heard from Mozambique, we've heard about Malawi, we've heard about Zambia. This is a new country now in the discussion. These countries are affected by periodic droughts than large-scale commercial farmers. The small-scale farmers are the ones that are suffering from these droughts compared to the large-scale commercial farmers. And then a quote, and it is not just climate change that causes food insecurity in Africa, says a Nigerian professor. African countries are facing a lot of problems. Right, here's where it comes from, based on a report by Sinji Hanoa Environmental News Service. So obviously this is a newspaper clipping or a blog or a newspaper article from a magazine even that talks about climate change and the issue of food security or food insecurity in a sub-Saharan Southern African context. Right, let's look at the questions now. First question, 2.1 for 2 marks. Remember, we always start with an easy definition, recall type of question where you give information that you've studied, which is applied in this context or related to some sort of source material or some sort of input from a graphic or a map or a paragraph. Explain the term food insecurity for, food security, very important. Food security for 2 marks. What are you going to say is food security? Okay, again, start by stating what you're talking about as the beginning of your sentence. Food security is the concept of whether or not, right, a good supply of food or enough food, for example, is available in a country. Right, so I'm saying here, food security is the concept of whether or not a good supply of food exists in a particular country, like South Africa or Zimbabwe or Zambia or Mozambique or Malawi as they are talking about in this context over here. Access and availability of food determines a country's level of food security. Okay, now let's just look at this answer that I've given here. Food security. Right, remember some of the niceties of answering for your examiner. You leave spaces between answers, you label questions correctly, and you rule off after a whole question. So try and observe some nice formatting and exam etiquette when you're answering these, because it makes it easier for your examiner to read. They find your answers more readily after having been tired for marking hundreds of scripts that day, and they give you your marks as you deserve. So food security is the concept of whether or not there's a good supply of food, 1 mark. It's about access and availability of the food, which determines a country's level of food security, 2 marks. So you're going to get your 2 marks here for saying something or for making 1 point in enough detail that allows you to get the 2. 1 times 2, 2 marks. Question 2.2 goes on. It says, explain how drought leads to food shortages, or how is drought an issue in food security, or how does drought cause food insecurity? Now we need to give 2 ideas multiplied by 2 because it's for 4 marks over here. Right, so we can start off by saying something like crops that fail as a result of no rainfall, because remember, plants need rain to grow and to survive. They need to be fed or watered. Crops that fail as a result of no rainfall, let me add that in there, and or water shortages, right, will mean less food is produced. Now that's only 1 point. Remember, this is a 2 times 2 question, so we need 2 points that have been carefully explained. So to get those first 2 marks, you've said crops that fail as a result of not enough rainfall, 1 mark, means that there is not enough food made, or there's food that is not produced in the right quantities or availability levels. So that's your first 2 marks over there, right? Then for the rest of this question, to earn our other 2 marks, we're going to say, as a result, there is not enough food to harvest and for people to eat. Now, if people are not going to get enough food, that means they are food insecure, or food security has become a major issue or a crisis for them. So there's not enough food or water available, and so it is a problem. 4 marks. Right, question 2.3 says, what sort of wild foods might hungry rural people eat? Can you suggest any disadvantage of eating wild foods? Now, if you go back, remember in our little paragraph over here, that Land Secretary George Mokindwa was his surname, of Malawi, says that Malawians are no longer able to feed themselves. Many people are surviving on wild foods, and half the population faces starvation and needs food aid. Now this question is asking you to think a little bit further. What sorts of wild food is out there that people could be eating, and what problems or what disadvantages to that would you suggest? Why is it problematic for people to be eating those things? Is it dangerous? Is it poisonous? Are they going to die or get sick as a result of eating that, etc.? So for 6 marks here, 3 times 2, we need to give 3 points that we've explained or outlined nicely to get full marks. We're going to say wild foods could include things like berries. Oops, let me write the word include here. Could include berries, pods, roots, insects, right? It doesn't mean just, when they say the word wild foods here, it doesn't mean we're just talking about plants. We're also talking about meat. So people could be eating locusts, they could be eating lizards, they could be eating snakes. wild food is anything that you and I ate as sort of primordial man, right, or woman, birds, small mammals like rabbits, right, although I don't think I could ever eat a poor little rabbit, shame. Those sorts of issues are what we're talking about for the wild foods. So that's the first part here for 6 marks. You'd get 2 marks for mentioning things like that, for talking about wild foods in that context. Then we need to tackle the second half of this question for the other 4 marks. Can you suggest any disadvantage of eating such wild foods? What are the problems or the issues if people are going to be eating snakes or berries or pods or roots or insects, locusts, mopani worms, etc., etc. I mean, mopani worms are not a problem and they're not dangerous and they're quite nice. I've had them before. But I mean, what sorts of other issues or disadvantages are people going to have from eating these sorts of things? Right, so you could talk about the poison. Some of these things are poisonous, right? Some of these foods are poisonous. If people eat the wrong berry, or they try and kill a poisonous snake to eat him, they might get bitten by the snake before they manage to kill it, in which case they're going to die as a result of the poison and not as a result of starvation. Also, some of these foods are unpalatable, right? That means it doesn't taste very nice. I must just write this word correctly, get the spelling right. Unpalatable food, right? It's very tasteless or doesn't taste very pleasant at all. That could be for 2 marks. It's not nice to eat, in other words, 2 marks. And then an environmental issue is biodiversity is going to be compromised. If we start allowing people to just kill all sorts of snakes or mammals or all sorts of things and eat those in large numbers, it means that we're going to lose those species, and obviously biodiversity is going to be reduced. And if we lose biodiversity, it means that our ecosystems are compromised. We don't have the sort of variety of the various species that makes ecology work, and that's also going to be an issue or a problem. So to get these 6 marks over here, all right, we basically were looking for this idea over here. What would the wild food be in the first instance? Give an example or 2. There we go, 2 marks. Why is it problematic, or what are some of the disadvantages? That it's poisonous, or that it's not nice to eat, it's unpalatable, right? That would be another idea there for the second set of 2 marks. And then this point here, the biodiversity or the ecological, environmental sort of impacts of allowing people to do that, how that could be problematic as well, provides you there with your last 2 sets of marks. So that's what gives us our 6 marks there in the end. Question 2.4 says, suggest why small-scale farmers are more vulnerable, there's the word vulnerable, to climate change, that's our key idea or our concept here, than large-scale commercial farmers. So in other words, why do subsistence farmers have more risk, or why are they going to suffer, why are they more vulnerable to climate change compared to large-scale farmers who are doing it for business, making a profit? It's a sort of commercial entity, right? So for 2 times 2, 4 marks over here, we might talk about the fact that small-scale farmers do not have the modern benefits or the technological benefits. They lack the technological benefits, right? And that would be things like irrigation systems, right, etc., like the large-scale farmers do. So what I'm saying here is that when the drought happens, or when we've got a heat wave or a water shortage or whatever the case may be, small-scale farmers don't have the benefits of the irrigation, the pipes, the watering of the field, etc., compared to the large-scale farmers, for example. So they will suffer more crop losses compared to the large-scale farmers who are able to water and irrigate their lands with this technology at their disposal. That's 1 point, so that'll get you 2 marks out of the 4. Another point would be things like they usually are subsistence farmers, and so they have little or no income to see them through in these hard times. So we can talk here in the second point of things like they lack capital, or they're unable to get loans from the banks. I mean, a commercial farmer, they can go and they can put their house as a sort of surety or a sort of proof of earnings, and the bank will loan them more money to see them through the drought or to help them out with irrigation and watering of their lands, etc. So they are obviously going to cope with those sorts of issues. Having said that, it's been quite a pleasure working with you, and I hope you all prepare well. So all the best and good luck for your exams, and thank you for doing geography with us.